March 23, 1945, the west bank of the Rhine. The river ran black under the morning mist. Its current, cold and relentless, had guarded the heart of Germany for centuries. On the muddy shore near Wesel, American engineers stood in silence, watching strange shapes slide down the embankment. Trucks, yet not trucks. Their green hulls glistened with dew, engines humming low. Each one bore 6 wheels, a propeller, and the white star of the U.S. Army. The men called them duck trucks, officially DUKWs, amphibious, awkward, and essential. Behind them, the thunder of artillery rolled like distant thunder. Ahead lay the Rhine, wide, fast, and fortified. German machine guns waited on the far side, confident that no American vehicle could possibly cross this torrent. But one by one, the ducks entered the water, cutting wakes across a river the Reich believed untouchable. In that quiet hour, as dawn broke over shattered bridges, the impossible was about to move, on 6 wheels. To understand how these machines came to exist, we must return to the beginning, to a problem America refused to leave unsolved. In 1940, as Europe burned, the United States was still technically at peace. Yet, within the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps, a quiet anxiety had taken root. Reports from Europe showed modern warfare's new truth. Mobility was everything. Armies that couldn't move across terrain, rivers, and coastlines fast enough simply ceased to exist. The early years of the war exposed a deep logistical gap. During the evacuations at Dunkirk and the landings in Norway and Crete, Allied commanders watched men drown and equipment sink because they lacked one vital link: a vehicle that could travel seamlessly from ship to shore, from surf to road. Landing craft could unload men and cargo onto beaches, but once there, every supply crate had to be carried or transferred by hand to waiting trucks inland. Hours were lost, sometimes days, and every minute under fire meant lives. The U.S. Army studied the problem intensely in 1941. Amphibious warfare was no longer theory, it was the future. The Marines needed something that could bring ammunition, fuel, and food directly from ship to combat line, without waiting for ports or cranes. The Navy had boats, the Army had trucks, but neither had a bridge between them. That's when a proposal arrived from General Motors' Yellow Truck and Coach Division in Pontiac, Michigan. It was an audacious idea. Take the standard 2.5-ton GMC CCKW truck, waterproof it, give it a propeller, and let it float. Most officers laughed. The quartermaster general himself called it a truck that wants to be a boat. Yet a handful of engineers, led by naval architect Rod Stevens and GM designer Frank Spear, saw something the skeptics didn't: a way to turn logistics into a weapon. The first prototype took shape in early 1942. They named it by function DUKW. D for 1942 model year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, W for twin rear axles. It looked ungainly. A long, narrow hull topped by a truck cab. But the team insisted it could drive off a ship's ramp, cross surf, climb onto sand, and keep rolling inland. The tests began on the Rouge River in Michigan, where engineers drove the vehicle straight into the water and prayed it would float. It did, barely. Leaks, steering failures, and unstable handling plagued the first trials, but the principle worked. The U.S. now had a blueprint for something the Axis powers didn't possess: true amphibious logistics. At a time when the war's future depended on mobility, the Duck had begun to waddle toward history. And soon, the engineers in Pontiac would refine their creation into something far beyond an experiment: a weapon of movement itself. The Pontiac engineers worked through freezing nights and humid days, determined to turn their fragile prototype into a battlefield machine. Every leak, every stalled engine, every flooded hull became a data point. Within months, the DUKW's shape evolved: smoother hull lines, stronger bilge pumps, and a propeller integrated beneath the rear. It could now carry over 2.5 tons of supplies, 25 soldiers, or a field gun, straight from ship to inland road without pause. The Army wasn't convinced. They ordered trials under extreme conditions. In one test, a DUKW was deliberately driven into high surf off Cape Cod during a storm. Waves tore at the hull. Winds reached 50 miles an hour. But the crew managed to steer it safely back to shore. That moment turned skeptics into believers. In 1943, the DUKW entered full production. General Motors retooled factories in Pontiac, Michigan, producing thousands of units. Each one was built with the same CCKW drivetrain, rugged, familiar, and easily reparable in the field. By summer, the Duck had become more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of American innovation in motion. Its first real test came not on a quiet river, but on the shores of Sicily. Operation Husky, July 1943, the largest amphibious invasion yet attempted by the Allies. When the beaches clogged with supplies and stranded landing craft, the DUKWs went to work. They swam through surf carrying ammunition, barrels of fuel, and radio trucks straight from ship decks to waiting troops inland. The results stunned commanders. In less than 48 hours, DUKWs had delivered over 1,000 tons of supplies, without a single working port. The British 8th Army reported, "The American amphibian truck has saved us days and lives." Even the Germans, watching from the highlands, couldn't believe what they saw. Their intelligence officers filed reports of wheeled vessels, moving independently between sea and land. They assumed they were specialized landing craft, never imagining they were ordinary trucks repurposed by American industry. From Sicily, the Ducks rolled onward to Salerno, to Anzio, and eventually to Normandy. At each beachhead, they became the invisible bloodstream of Allied logistics. They carried artillery shells under fire, rescued wounded men from surf, and hauled bridge sections across flooded roads. By 1944, the DUKW had earned the trust of generals and the devotion of soldiers. Its crews, often from the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, came to see it not as a novelty, but as salvation, the one machine that could keep them moving when everything else was stuck. Across the Atlantic, the Germans still believed rivers and mud were their best defenses. They had no idea that by the time the Americans reached the Rhine, those same rivers would become pathways of invasion. And as the war pressed toward Germany's borders, the DUKW's story would shift, from invention to lifeline, from experiment to instrument of victory. They called themselves duck drivers. Few war medals and even fewer appeared in newsreels, yet without them, the front could not have advanced. Most were not combat soldiers but mechanics, dock workers, and farm boys who had learned to navigate both road and tide. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps trained them in coastal waters, how to handle tides, calculate drift, and steer by compass when the horizon disappeared. Operating a DUKW under fire was nothing like driving a truck. On land, the six-wheel drive gripped mud and gravel with steady traction. But once in water, the vehicle became vulnerable, heavy, slow, and exposed. German gunners quickly learned that these floating trucks carried ammunition, and they made them priority targets. Still, the Duck crews pressed on. In Sicily, they endured surf that overturned landing craft. In Normandy, they faced waves taller than their hulls. Many recalled how the smell of diesel mixed with salt and cordite as shells burst overhead. But they also remembered the faces of infantrymen waiting on the beach, hungry, low on ammunition, desperate for supplies that only the Ducks could bring. Tactically, the DUKW represented something the Germans hadn't anticipated: continuity, the ability to sustain an offensive without pause. When traditional trucks stopped at a riverbank or a cratered road, the Duck simply kept going. It could cross beaches, climb gradients of up to 30 degrees, and traverse floods that halted tanks. Commanders quickly learned to integrate them into assault plans. At Anzio, DUKWs landed artillery shells within hours of the invasion, sustaining the beachhead while engineers cleared debris. In Normandy, they operated day and night, linking supply ships offshore to frontline units beyond the dunes. At Omaha, where the surf swallowed tanks and landing craft, DUKWs hauled wounded soldiers back to ships, one of the few vehicles able to move both directions under fire. For the men who drove them, survival meant improvisation. They carried spare spark plugs in waterproof tins, patched holes with rubber and tape, and used empty fuel cans as makeshift flotation aids. Crews often gave their vehicles nicknames: Sea Biscuit, Aqua Mule, Mud Hen. Each duck developed its own quirks. Some steered wide in current, others leaked slowly from rivet seams. Yet all shared one trait: persistence. Behind every successful crossing was a crew drenched, shivering, and smiling faintly as they touched solid ground again. They weren't frontline heroes, yet their work decided whether those heroes would eat, shoot, or move forward. The Germans saw only strange silhouettes drifting toward them through the mist, machines that defied rivers, tides, and expectation. They joked about the American ducks, until they realized those ducks were carrying an entire army on their backs. But beyond the courage of their crews lay the genius of their design. A machine engineered to bridge two worlds, and to turn geography itself into an ally. They called themselves duck drivers. Few war medals and even fewer appeared in newsreels, yet without them, the front could not have advanced. Most were not combat soldiers but mechanics, dock workers, and farm boys who had learned to navigate both road and tide. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps trained them in coastal waters, how to handle tides, calculate drift, and steer by compass when the horizon disappeared. Operating a DUKW under fire was nothing like driving a truck. On land, the six-wheel drive gripped mud and gravel with steady traction. But once in water, the vehicle became vulnerable, heavy, slow, and exposed. German gunners quickly learned that these floating trucks carried ammunition, and they made them priority targets. Still, the duck crews pressed on. In Sicily, they endured surf that overturned landing craft. In Normandy, they faced waves taller than their hulls. Many recalled how the smell of diesel mixed with salt and cordite as shells burst overhead. But they also remembered the faces of infantrymen waiting on the beach, hungry, low on ammunition, desperate for supplies that only the ducks could bring. Tactically, the DUKW represented something the Germans hadn't anticipated: continuity. The ability to sustain an offensive without pause. When traditional trucks stopped at a riverbank or a cratered road, the duck simply kept going. It could cross beaches, climb gradients of up to 30 degrees, and traverse floods that halted tanks. Commanders quickly learned to integrate them into assault plans. At Anzio, DUKWs landed artillery shells within hours of the invasion, sustaining the beachhead while engineers cleared debris. In Normandy, they operated day and night, linking supply ships offshore to frontline units beyond the dunes. At Omaha, where the surf swallowed tanks and landing craft, DUKWs hauled wounded soldiers back to ships, one of the few vehicles able to move both directions under fire. For the men who drove them, survival meant improvisation. They carried spare spark plugs in waterproof tins, patched holes with rubber and tape, and used empty fuel cans as makeshift flotation aids. Crews often gave their vehicles nicknames: Sea Biscuit, Aqua Mule, Mud Hen. Each duck developed its own quirks. Some steered wide in current, others leaked slowly from rivet seams. Yet all shared one trait: persistence. Behind every successful crossing was a crew drenched, shivering, and smiling faintly as they touched solid ground again. They weren't frontline heroes, yet their work decided whether those heroes would eat, shoot, or move forward. The Germans saw only strange silhouettes drifting toward them through the mist, machines that defied rivers, tides, and expectation. They joked about the American ducks, until they realized those ducks were carrying an entire army on their backs. But beyond the courage of their crews lay the genius of their design. A machine engineered to bridge two worlds, and to turn geography itself into an ally. March 23, 1945. 9 p.m. searchlights pierced the low clouds above the Rhine. The river stretched nearly 400 yards wide, swollen by winter rain. To the Germans, it remained the last great defensive line, a natural fortress. To the Americans and British preparing along its western banks, it was an obstacle that had to be crossed, no matter the cost. The Allied plan was massive: Operation Plunder, a coordinated assault led by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. To the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army readied its own crossing. In total, over 1 million men, 5,500 guns, and 1,500 aircraft stood poised. Yet, for all the firepower assembled, the real key to success rested not in tanks or planes, but in amphibious trucks, lined up silently along the shore. The DUKWs waited under camouflage nets, engines idling softly. Inside, their crews checked bilge pumps, radios, and ropes. They had crossed smaller rivers before, the Seine, the Moselle, the Saar, but this was different. The Rhine was wide, fast, and under direct fire. German 88mm guns and mortars zeroed the far bank. Spotlights swept the water at night. Just before midnight, the first wave moved. British and American artillery unleashed one of the heaviest bombardments of the Western Front, over 65,000 shells in a single hour. The riverbanks shook as flames lit the horizon. Then, amid the roar, the DUKWs entered the water. Each one carried soldiers, ammunition, or heavy gear, bridging sections, fuel drums, even jeeps. The current fought them with brutal force. Spray froze on helmets. Engines groaned under the load. But the ducks pushed on, their propellers biting through the black water. Infantrymen crouched inside, whispering prayers, staring at the tracer fire that arced above the surface like orange comets. On the opposite bank, German defenders fired blindly through smoke. Machine guns raked the river, yet the DUKWs kept moving. Allied engineers reported fewer losses than expected. The combination of speed, darkness, and surprise had worked. One U.S. report described it simply: the DUKWs performed superbly. No other vehicle could have crossed in such conditions. Within hours, hundreds had made the journey. Entire companies of the 17th Airborne Division were ferried across to establish bridgeheads. Artillery pieces followed soon after, some carried whole on the backs of ducks, others in sections. By dawn, the far bank was in Allied hands. The Rhine, Hitler's boast of an unbreachable barrier, had been violated by trucks on water. But the crossing had only begun. Ahead lay days of relentless transport, constant fire, and a race to feed an army that now stood inside Germany itself. The first waves had crossed, but the true measure of success lay in what followed. For the Allied assault to hold, the Rhine had to become a supply line, not a barrier. And so, as dawn broke over the smoldering riverbanks, fleets of DUKWs began their ceaseless shuttle. Every hour, dozens of amphibious trucks ferried men, munitions, and fuel across the current. The Rhine's banks became floating highways, columns of DUKWs queuing to load supplies on the west side, while others splashed ashore under smoke screens on the east. Crews worked in shifts of exhaustion. They ate cold rations while steering through fog and artillery bursts. Some had not slept in 36 hours. The river fought them as fiercely as the enemy. Swift currents pushed against overloaded hulls. Shrapnel punctured thin steel. When a duck took a hit, its crew bailed with hand pumps, keeping the engine alive long enough to reach shore. Field mechanics worked knee-deep in water, patching bullet holes with rubber cement and wrenches slick with oil. In the chaos, discipline ruled. Each vehicle was tracked, scheduled, and logged by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. Supplies were timed to arrive at the moment bridgeheads expanded. Artillery ammunition, gasoline, and food reached frontline battalions with a precision that stunned German intelligence. They had believed the Rhine crossing would paralyze Allied logistics for days. Instead, by the second evening, full divisions were resupplied and moving inland. German radio reports reflected disbelief. One intercepted message from a Wehrmacht officer near Wesel read, "The Americans are crossing the river without bridges. They come by hundreds. They never stop." By March 25th, the Allies had established 3 major crossings. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges alongside the DUKW routes, but the amphibians kept operating, flexible, untiring, impossible to predict. Even when bridges were hit by artillery or collapsed under tank weight, the ducks carried on. For the soldiers on the far bank, their steady arrival meant survival. Fuel arrived before tanks ran dry. Food reached units isolated in flooded terrain. Evacuation of the wounded became faster than ever before. To men fighting in the mud of the lower Rhine, the faint rumble of a DUKW engine meant hope. By the end of March, the Rhine, once the heart of Germany's western defense, was no longer a frontier. It had become a thoroughfare for Allied victory. As one American war correspondent wrote, "They drove across the river that Hitler said no one could cross, and they did it in trucks that swam." When the last DUKW rolled onto German soil, the war in Europe had entered its final phase, and the quiet machine that made it possible had already become legend. By the final week of March 1945, the impossible had become routine. Across the entire Rhine front, from Remagen to Wesel, the DUKWs had transformed one of Europe's mightiest rivers into a conveyor belt of men and material. In just 4 days, more than 25,000 troops and 5,000 tons of supplies crossed under fire. Entire armored divisions followed, pushing eastward into the industrial heart of Germany. To Allied commanders, the Rhine crossing wasn't just a victory, it was a vindication. Years of investment in mobility, logistics, and engineering had paid off. Every battle fought before, from North Africa to Italy to Normandy, had been a rehearsal for this moment. And at its core stood a humble machine built not for glory but for efficiency. The DUKW gave the Allies something no Axis army ever possessed: momentum without pause. Traditional logistics relied on fixed infrastructure, ports, bridges, depots. The DUK erased those dependencies. It allowed warfare to flow uninterrupted across natural barriers. Patton's Third Army advanced so quickly after crossing that German headquarters struggled even to locate the new front line. Captured officers expressed disbelief. One German colonel, interrogated after the crossing, remarked that the Americans' ability to float trucks across rivers faster than we can build defenses had destroyed any hope of holding the Western Front. German soldiers, exhausted and outmaneuvered, watched in despair as DUKWs ferried troops and tanks through bomb smoke and fog, where days before, they had believed water alone would save them. Reports from Wehrmacht field command spoke of unceasing river movement, calling it an operation of machines, not men. They could not comprehend how an army so vast could maintain perfect rhythm across such difficult terrain. What they didn't see were the thousands of ordinary American mechanics, engineers, and drivers making it possible, men who had turned technology into endurance. For the Allies, the strategic result was immediate. With the Rhine behind them, the last major natural obstacle in Western Europe was gone. Supply lines extended seamlessly from Normandy to the Elbe. Fuel, food, and ammunition arrived faster than ever recorded in modern warfare. In April, Patton's forces captured Frankfurt, while Montgomery's troops drove north into the Ruhr. The industrial heart of Germany was cut off, the war's outcome sealed. Yet, amidst the triumph, there was quiet recognition among commanders. Without the DUKW, the crossing might have taken weeks, not days. Every general who watched those amphibious trucks move through smoke understood they were witnessing something new, a logistical revolution born from American industry and ingenuity. But beyond strategy and steel, the DUKW story carried a deeper meaning, one that would outlast the war itself. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the DUKW's work was far from finished. Even after Germany's surrender in May 1945, fleets of amphibious trucks continued to serve, ferrying displaced civilians, hauling relief supplies, and clearing wreckage from ruined ports. The same machines that had crossed the Rhine under fire now carried bread, medicine, and hope to a continent in ruins. In military records, the DUKW's combat achievements appeared almost statistical. Tonnage delivered, rivers crossed, operations supported. But to those who had relied on it, the DUK was more than equipment. It was a companion. Soldiers wrote home about the vehicles that never failed us. Machines that swam through chaos when everything else stopped. Its influence spread quickly. The U.S. Marine Corps adopted DUKWs for amphibious training in the Pacific. When American troops landed in Japan's occupied territories, DUKWs followed, bridging the destroyed harbors of Okinawa and Yokohama. In 1950, during the Korean War, they returned to battle once again, carrying men and guns through the frozen rivers of Incheon and the tidal flats of Wonsan. Their design, virtually unchanged, still performed flawlessly. Even in peace, their usefulness endured. In the decades that followed, the U.S. Army, Coast Guard, and civilian agencies employed DUKWs for flood rescue, disaster relief, and Arctic exploration. During the 1953 North Sea floods, British and American DUKWs rescued hundreds from submerged towns. In 1955, in New Orleans, they delivered food to thousands stranded by hurricane waters. From Michigan to Manila, their legend grew quietly, not through parades or speeches but through service. Many were eventually sold as surplus, their olive drab paint replaced with bright colors as they became tourist craft in Boston, London, and Sydney. Yet, even stripped of insignia, they remained symbols of a time when engineering met necessity under the shadow of war. For military historians, the DUKW represented something more profound than mechanical success. It embodied the American doctrine of adaptability, the belief that no obstacle was insurmountable if one could think differently. Where the Axis fortified rivers, the Allies built machines to cross them. Where others waited for perfect conditions, the U.S. created tools to overcome imperfection itself. By the time production ceased in 1945, over 21,000 DUKWs had been built. Many rusted away on forgotten shores. Others were preserved in museums, their hulls bearing scars of shrapnel and salt. To walk beside one today is to stand before the spirit of an era, a time when simple innovation helped end a world war. As one wartime engineer later reflected, the DUKW didn't just carry supplies, it carried possibility. And that possibility, born from steel, seawater, and stubborn will, would ripple far beyond the battlefields of 1945. In the grand story of World War II, the DUKW rarely headlines the chapters of victory. It had no guns, no armor, no medals. Yet, when historians retrace the Allied advance from Normandy to the Rhine, its shadow stretches quietly behind every triumph. This unarmed amphibian turned rivers into roads, uncertainty into confidence, and distance into momentum. Proved that in war, greatness often hides not in destruction, but in the power to move forward. The Germans had built fortresses. The Americans had built a truck that could swim. One side clung to walls. The other invented bridges. And that difference, the choice to solve rather than to stop, shaped the future of warfare and the character of a nation. The DUKW stood for a kind of American genius that thrived in practicality. It was never glamorous, but always reliable. It did not inspire fear, only trust. And in that quiet reliability lay its heroism. Today, a few still survive, their engines worn, their paint faded, their hulls echoing with the memories of soldiers who once rode them through smoke and rain. They remind us that innovation is not born from pride, but from necessity. Because in 1945, when the world seemed divided by rivers, the DUKW proved that no barrier of water, distance, or will was ever truly impassable.